chance of either side ever winning, the forces of good and evil continue to fight an eternal battle. And in this spiritual battle, the devil represents the ultimate symbol of evil on earth. Known as the Prince of Darkness, Beelzebub, and Lucifer, Satan must take human form now and then to display his power. And when this happens, the victims of his demonic possession are plunged into a battle the likes of which they have never seen before. Their last hope is exorcism. Does it really help, or is it just another form of mental torture? It was late at night, and the woman had been sleeping for a while. She suddenly opened her eyes and sat up in bed. In her mind, she replayed the mess her son had made at supper time. Her anger shifted to an intense, irrational rage. She headed to her son's bedroom with a cruel smile on her face, practically a demonic grin. She approached his bed and wrapped her hands around her son's neck. In her head, she could hear a voice telling her to kill him. In a flash, she regained her senses, horrified by the act she had been about to commit. How could this be possible? She didn't know who she was anymore. She felt like she was losing control of her actions, as if she was possessed. Is the void filled with invisible beings and disincarnate spirits? Is it possible for dwellers of the spirit world to take over our soul, our willpower? Can we be possessed? The belief that a living being can be possessed by the spirit of a disincarnate entity is reinforced by local customs and popular and religious beliefs. In Brazil, many psychologists will not hesitate to attribute their patients' problems to a case of possession, while their North American counterparts are more inclined to diagnose their patients as suffering from schizophrenia. In this area, more than any other, psychiatric jargon does not hold all the answers.
In the summer of 1978, a Chicago woman who was taking a nap began speaking in her sleep in a guttural voice that belonged to none other than Teresita Bassa. Teresita had been found dead a few weeks earlier, murdered in her apartment. So, in this voice from beyond the grave, the woman began telling how she had been strangled by her co-worker, Alan Chauvery. The police arrested Alan Chauvery. In Chauvery's home, the police found several pieces of jewelry belonging to Teresita Bassa. Faced with the facts, Chauvery confessed to his crime. So for the first time in the history of the United States, testimony from beyond the grave was admitted into a court of law. The testimony of Teresita Bassa, who had been murdered by Chauvery.
Nearly 10 years after her brother's suicide, Jézanne Defay, a young single mom from the Outaouais area, found herself faced with mysterious and disturbing events. She noticed that her mind was at times taken over by invisible entities that seemed to be evil in nature. Shortly after her daughter was born, Annick Laprade was surprised by the child's strange behavior. She would stare with eyes void of emotion, and her actions would be unexplainably violent. For Annick Laprade, the truth was gradually becoming clear. Another soul had taken possession of her daughter. What happened with Teresita Bassa, Jézanne Defay, and Annick Laprade were classic examples of psychic possession. They represent more than 90% of the cases, while the remainder fall into another category which is much more disturbing: demonic possession. According to the Catholic Church, 3 major symptoms appear in the presence of demonic possession. The victim speaks or understands languages that were previously unknown to her. The victim can find hidden objects, read minds, and tell the future. And the victim demonstrates strength beyond its normal physical capacity. If all of these symptoms are noted, an exorcism can be requested, but the process is complex and highly rare.
In most dioceses, the chancellor receives the initial request. In some dioceses, there is a requirement for the person to speak with their own priest first, or to speak with some other priest that they trust. So there is a first step to the process of requesting an exorcism.
Since the introduction of clinical therapy, it is common practice to refer alleged possession victims to a psychiatrist. After all, most of the criteria for establishing a case of possession are subjective and may be found in a patient suffering from mental illness. But there are exceptions. In 1947, 13-year-old Ronald Unkeler was given an exorcism ritual in a St. Louis hospital. For weeks on end, priests would stay by his bedside and work at ridding the boy of the demonic hold on him. His experience was what inspired the most terrifying movie of all time, The Exorcist. When we talk about possession, we feel like we've gone back in time to the Middle Ages. Given today's modern medicine, you'd think that this strange phenomenon would be a thing of the past. But it's not. Are we to conclude that superstition is stronger than reason? Or that science was wrong? The phenomenon of possession can be found in nearly every religion and culture. While it is often associated with the devil in Western cultures, this is not the case in other parts of the world.
In other cultures, it may be a spirit, good or bad. It may be the spirit of a deceased relative or someone who is just being buried. There are many possibilities. There's even talk of animal possession in some cultures as well. But in Western cultures, we are quick to attribute all possessions to the devil himself.
Cases of possession are particularly frequent in groups whose religion is based in African tradition like Voodoo or Umbanda. In Western society, more and more therapists are beginning to believe that behavioral problems such as schizophrenia and multiple personalities may be an infestation by an invisible entity.
In some cases of possession, it is believed to be caused by an entity, someone who is deceased and is unaware that they are deceased. Some of these entities may be malicious, which could help to explain poltergeist activities like rapping noises in the wall and vases breaking. In Brazil, this type of infestation is so openly accepted that some psychiatrists and psychologists even speak of therapeutic exorcisms. and use an exorcism ritual to help heal their patients. In other cases, it could be an entity with a message to pass on. This is often the case when we speak of mediums who allow their body to be a channel for an entity. If we take a look at religion, we can see a lot less tolerance in this area. When it comes to possession, either you're filled with the Holy Spirit or you're possessed by the devil. And if you're possessed by the devil, the only way to avoid going to hell is to be exorcised. The science community is the final player in this controversial debate. Although more and more psychologists and psychotherapists are accepting infestation by a foreign entity as an explanation for certain behavioral problems, I would say that the medical community as a whole views the concept of possession as backwards, middle-aged thinking to cover up clearly identified psychological pathologies.
In 1993, Jézanne Desfaits moved into an apartment building in Hull, Quebec. It was the beginning of a horrendous nightmare. Memories of her brother Régis, who had died several years earlier, kept coming back to haunt her. He seemed to be everywhere. He was in her dreams, and he even seemed to be present when she was awake.
8 years after his death, I moved into an apartment. It didn't suit me, but I wanted it. There was something in me pushing me to sign the lease. And it was in that apartment that everything happened. Objects would move. I could hear his voice, and I would see his image when I looked at myself in the mirror. Everywhere I went, I felt a presence within me.
In September 1994, following a friend's advice, Jézanne decided to contact Nicole, who was a medium.
I called Nicole and she came to my place. We held a seance during which she saw my brother very clearly.
Through the psychic, Jézanne learned that not only was her brother present, but other spirits as well. And they weren't the friendly variety. Régis was there to protect her and to warn the young single mom of an imminent threat that was approaching. Evil forces were preparing to strike.
We were sitting in the kitchen and all of a sudden there was a strong wind blowing and a putrid smell that was making us nauseous. It was pretty gross. I could see black crosses and blood on the walls. It stunk. Everything was happening very quickly, as if we weren't supposed to see it. Nicole was very afraid, said she didn't work with that kind of energy. She was leaving. As she got up to leave, I wanted to get up too. But it was as if someone invisible grabbed my wrist and held me down. My wrist was very sore. I wanted to shout out to Nicole to come back, but I couldn't. I heard her say, "Okay, I'll stay." I told her my wrist and arm were sore. And she said, "My God, he's inside you. Your arm is all black."
With Nicole's help, Jézanne was able to free herself of this mysterious force that was trying to possess her. Free. But for how long? On September 22nd, 1994, as she was heading to bed, Jézanne was surprised to hear noises coming from her living room. She had the impression that someone was spinning her work chair.
There was just one wall separating the living room from where I was. I gathered all the courage I could muster and went into the living room. I saw the chair, which was no longer at the desk where it was supposed to be. It was in the middle of the living room and it started moving, heading directly towards me.
Jézanne backed out of the room in horror. She tried to stabilize her breathing. Then she heard other noises, the sound of toys. The thing, whatever it was now in her son's room.
I went into the hallway and I could hear the noises getting louder since I was getting closer. When I got into the bedroom, the noises stopped. My son was sleeping peacefully. I tried to pick him up. I was shaking, trembling with fear. I couldn't get to him. It was as if there was an energy field around him blocking me.
She went back to the living room. She couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the phone, and buttons were being pressed randomly, as if invisible fingers were playing a tune on her phone. She finally managed to call her friend Josie.
When she answered, I told her, "Come right away, don't even bother getting dressed. I'm totally paralyzed here." I tried to get up and I couldn't. It was as if from the waist down I was a block of cement. I couldn't budge. When she said, "Okay, I'm coming right away," at that moment my second line began to ring. I said goodbye to José and answered the second line. It was Nicole. She had no idea what was happening to me. She had no way of knowing, and she told me to grab my son and get out of my apartment immediately. I told her I couldn't. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move.
Jézanne could no longer hear the medium's words. Her eyes were riveted on a strange sight playing out before her. Multicolored dots appeared, forming the figures of 3 people. Suddenly, she heard a knock at the door. It was Josie. Jézanne went to answer the door, and together the women went into her son's room where he lies sleeping soundly. José had no problem picking him up. She did not sense the electric fence that had prevented Jézanne from getting to her son. The 2 women left the apartment immediately. Jézanne went back home a few days later. Days went by with no further unusual events. The situation took a turn for the worst when Jézanne invited a couple of friends over, and Vanessa went to the washroom.
We heard Vanessa screaming, as if her finger was stuck in the door or something. She was screaming at the top of her lungs. We ran to the bathroom and asked Vanessa what was wrong. My bathroom door doesn't lock, but we couldn't get it open. Then, suddenly, the door flew open. I fell on the floor, and the door closed by itself. Vanessa was on the floor between the wall and the toilet. She was staring at the fan on the ceiling and was trembling all over. It was obvious that she had been traumatized. She kept screaming and yelled, "Something scary just came out of the fan." I told her to stop screaming, get a hold of herself. It was just a fan. That was when she fainted. I turned, since I wanted to get her out of there, and the door wouldn't budge again. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw her get up. I turned around, and she tried to talk to me. She kept saying, "You're not getting out of here. You're not getting out of here," but with a deep voice. It was very scary, and I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. And then she put her hands out in front of her and started moving towards me.
Jézanne managed to get her friend out of the washroom, but Vanessa had literally gone insane. She began running around the apartment, speaking incoherently, her body shaking with convulsions. Faced with this uncontrollable behavior, Jézanne and Etienne had no choice but to call 911.
When we arrived at the apartment, her respiratory rate was about 50 to 60 breaths per minute. We sat her down in a chair, and I tried to get her to breathe more slowly until she went unconscious. At that moment, I freed up her breathing passage so that she could breathe easier. All of a sudden, she opened her eyes, and what I felt at that moment shocked me. I stood up with a start, knocking over the chair. She slid down off the chair and began slithering around the floor like a snake.
Once they had her pinned down, the police officers and ambulance attendants agreed that an exorcist would do her more good than a hospital. The medium agreed to come back to Jézanne's apartment to exorcise poor Vanessa.
So the medium arrived, and they moved her into the kitchen with the medium. I called my supervisor to let him know what was happening. And while I was talking to my supervisor, the medium was performing the exorcism in the kitchen, so I didn't actually see what she did. But I did ask my supervisor to pray for us. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I was so messed up by what I had felt that it seemed important for someone to be praying for us.
It took many hours of prayer before Vanessa came to her senses. As far as Jézanne Defay was concerned, this time the message was clear. She had to move. In a story like Jézanne Defay's, there's a fine line between haunting and possession. In cases like this, it's sometimes difficult to separate the real phenomena from those fed by the imagination and desires of the individuals who see them. Perhaps Vanessa had certain expectations in mind before going to Jézanne's apartment. Perhaps she expected to see something unusual happen. Was she the victim of an unknown entity or her own imagination? Is there any way of knowing for sure? In 1996, after her difficult birth, Annick Laprade had only one wish: to see her daughter. But her exhilaration was about to turn into an incredible nightmare.
When she was first born, Marie-Claude cried a lot. Her nasal passage was blocked, so the doctors took care of it. She cried all night long. Some of my family was visiting. Around midnight, my guests had left and I was all alone in my hospital room. I decided that I wanted to see her for some quiet mother-daughter time. I asked the nurses to bring her to me, which they did. Marie-Claude was sleeping, so I spoke to her quietly. Then she opened her eyes, and what I saw was a cold, empty look, and her pupils were very dilated.
Annick thought she must be imagining things, suffering from some sort of postnatal shock.
For the first 2 years of her life, Marie-Claude cried a lot. Naturally, there were calm periods, but in general, she was a crybaby.
When the child reached the age of 2, she continued to display abnormal behavior. She was hyperactive. Doctors told the parents that the young girl was probably suffering from a multiple personality disorder. They recommended that the child see a psychiatrist, but the wait seemed endless.
At one point, Marie-Claude was chasing her brother, and we could see that she wanted to hurt him. So I sent her to her room, and we could hear sounds, a real loud bing, bang, boom. And I held the door shut. Then the noises stopped, and Marie-Claude calmed down. Usually she would calm down after a temper tantrum, and then she would go to sleep. When I opened the door, Marie-Claude was sitting against the wall. She wasn't sleeping, she was drawing on the wall with her own blood. She turned and looked at us and began to laugh. I didn't think my daughter was herself at that moment.
With no help from traditional medicine, Annick Laprade turned to an osteopath that she knew.
For 8 months, she received treatments from an osteopath, and we could see a difference in her. But the temper tantrums persisted. The osteopath asked me if I was open-minded and said she knew someone named Michael who worked with energy who might be able to help. So we set up an appointment with Michael because we didn't have anything to lose. We were still on the waiting list to see a psychiatrist. When we saw Michael for the first time, Marie-Claude was with me, so he observed her and asked a few questions. Then he said that there were 2 entities in Marie-Claude's energy field. He suggested that we perform a ritual to release those entities and to fully incarnate Marie-Claude's soul. Obviously, we were quite shocked to receive news like this. But again, we had nothing to lose. No drugs were involved, so there was no risk to her health. And I decided to go for it.
A release ritual was organized, during which Michael said prayers and ordered the entities to leave the child's body.
At one point, Michael ordered the entities to leave Marie-Claude's energy field. And I felt like a current passed through me. It only lasted a second or two. It felt as if someone was pressing on my chest, and I had difficulty breathing. I panicked for a moment and then looked at Michael, and he was looking at me. Then he repeated the order for the entities to leave. When I fully came back to my senses, I noticed that Mary Claude was soaked in sweat, and her cheeks were bright red, but she was also peaceful and calm.
Practically overnight, Marie-Claude's behavior changed. She was now calmer, and her angry outbursts were gone. There was no doubt in Annick Laprat's mind that her daughter had genuinely been released from evil forces trying to invade her body. Annick Laprat's story is surprising. The victim was a mere infant, so it was hard to accuse her of having imagined her symptoms. And the young mother's approach was equally surprising, choosing to expose her daughter to an alternative technique that proved to be highly effective. The spiritual approach versus the medical approach. Now there's an interesting debate.
In his famous work entitled The Spirit's Book, Allan Kardec, the father of Spiritism, speaks of entities that are capable of insinuating themselves into a person's mind and influencing their behavior. Kardec does not mention possession per se, but he does mention a form of spiritual parasite. I would say that even though Kardec lived more than a century ago, his interpretation of the possession phenomenon has always been supported by individuals interested in spiritism or paranormal phenomena, like the people who intervened in the cases of Gézanne Desfaits and Annick Laprat. Obviously, those who oppose this theory, particularly the medical community, like to point out that Allan Kardec died in 1869. And back then, very little was known about major psychological pathologies. In their opinion, believing that spirits can take possession of an individual and influence their behavior is going back to the Dark Ages. Clearly, no one from the medical community would dare defend this theory. However, it's a bit crazy since more and more people, including therapists, are openly accepting the theory of possession as a possible alternative to behavioral problems.
Adam Crabtree, one of Toronto's best-known psychotherapists, also thinks that disincarnate spirits may be at the root of some behavioral problems. In his book Multiple Man, Crabtree presents many cases that he himself handled that defy conventional psychiatric prognosis. One case dealt with a young woman who claimed to be possessed by the spirit of an unknown entity. When he placed his patient under hypnosis, Crabtree was able to carry on a conversation with this invisible intruder.
I talked with this presence, and it turned out to be male, and it turned out, in fact, to claim to be her father. And this person really didn't know that he was dead, although her father was dead. And he was quite sort of definite about his situation, that he wasn't dead, and that also that he was, yes, it's true, he was there with his daughter, but that's all right. And when I talked about this fact that seemed a bit interfering with her life, it didn't bother him. He didn't see anything wrong with it. So I didn't know how to get this person sort of to become aware of the actual situation. So I asked the person to become aware of their body. And when he did, he was aware of a female body, and that was very shocking to him. And it was the beginning of it being able to get down to work, down to brass tacks.
Adam Crabtree doesn't claim that all personality disorders can be traced back to disincarnate spirits, but in rare cases, this possibility should not be excluded. Approaches like those used by Crabtree remain marginally accepted by society, but the positive results that they have had on patients cannot simply be dismissed as a placebo effect, any more so than the cases of Gézanne Desfaits and Annick Laprat, where once again a more esoteric approach produced amazing results.
In other countries, people consult mediums. and other individuals who have an alternative approach to the human existence, who feel things that we don't tend to feel here in North America or in Western Europe. Should we be offended by what they do? No. We should use it in the best possible way.
The idea that an individual can be possessed by the disincarnate spirit of a deceased person is a common belief in spiritualism. More and more scientists are accepting that this possibility might help to explain certain behavioral problems such as multiple personality disorders. But what about cases where the entities have never been incarnated? Or worse yet, when the entity claims to be the devil himself? In 1949, in the Washington suburb of Cottage City, strange things began to happen around 13-year-old Ronald Unkeller. Objects would literally jump off the ground when Robbie passed by. At night, the teen's bed would shake so violently that Ronald couldn't fall asleep. The Unkellers consulted parapsychologists and priests. They even had their son admitted to Georgetown Hospital, where he underwent a series of medical exams. The results were clear. The teenager was not suffering from any known psychiatric condition. Discouraged, the Unkellers moved Ronald to St. Louis, where most of their family lived, in the hope that the new environment would rid them of this evil spirit. Unfortunately, things just got worse. During the day, the teen was calm and passive, but at night, he became violent and aggressive. Inexplicable marks began to appear on his body, and it wasn't long before objects began to fly and furniture began to move by itself again. The child was turned over to the care of Father William Bowdern, a Jesuit with St. Francis of Xavier. The priest believed that Ronald was possessed by a demon. He had Ronald admitted to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, and that's where Father Bowdern and a half-dozen other priests performed an exorcism ritual. Night after night, prayers were repeated, asking for deliverance of the teen's soul. Whenever he was released to change his linen, he would hit the priests and spit in their faces. When the priest sprinkled him with holy water, he screamed in agony and yelled out unspeakable profanity. In May of 1949, the priests gathered once again at Ronald's bedside. This session proved to be one of the most violent ever. The priests were literally yelling out their prayers while Ronald was yelling out the worst profanities imaginable. Then, that afternoon, the exhausted teen fell into a deep sleep. A sound like that of a gunshot rang out in the hospital. When he awoke, the teenager was calm and relaxed. He appeared to have no recollection of what he had been through. He went back to a normal life, completely oblivious of the 6 months he had spent possessed. The possession of Ronald Unkeller inspired the William Blatty bestseller, The Exorcist, which was adapted into a movie in 1973. Demonic possession. The worst kind possible. When we utter the words, images of the movie Exorcist race through our minds. Terrifying scenes that shocked conservative North America to its very roots. From the Church's viewpoint, the existence of the devil is a reality, if not a necessity. But the Vatican is quite conservative when it comes to the subject of exorcism. It now prefers a more hands-off approach to hardcore cases of possession. That was the position adopted by the Church in its new exorcism ritual decreed in Rome on November 22nd, 1998.
Ce qu'il dit, c'est que
In Christianity, there is a tendency to say that people are tormented and not possessed by the devil. All Christians are possessed by Christ. We all have a part of him in us. We are all members of the body of Christ.
Donc, on est possédé par le Christ. On appartient au Christ. On est membre du corps du Christ. C'est donc...
So, in terms of exorcism, a person is not possessed by the devil. They are simply tormented by the devil.
Par le diable. Elle est tourmentée par le diable.
Since the Renaissance period, demonic possession and exorcism have been associated with a ritual that harkens back to old superstitions.
Le dernier rituel...
The last exorcism ritual dated back to 1614, and its content still harkens back to the Middle Ages.
par l'esprit du Moyen Âge, même si on...
In that ritual, the priest actually addresses the devil, shouts at him, and orders the devil to leave the victim's body. So it was a very dramatic expression of the exorcism ritual.
Donc, une représentation extrêmement dramatique.
The current exorcism ritual involves a lot more liturgy. It is a celebration of prayer, a celebration during which the exorcist does not address himself directly to the devil, but rather to God. He prays to God through Jesus and asks for the Holy Spirit to come down into the devout Catholic who is being tormented by the devil.
The document warns of the dangers of the imagination that can lead a man to believe that he has fallen prey to the devil. It recommends distinguishing between real cases of demonic possession and cases where the victim thinks he has been cursed. The new ritual makes a distinction between deprecatory exorcism, which consists of simple prayers, and imperative exorcism, which involves a great deal of liturgy.
Deprecatory exorcism, or major exorcism, is practiced in a relatively intimate atmosphere.
Je dirais de relative intimité. Il y aura le
It involves the priest and the tormented victim.
avec le fidèle tourmenté.
It may also be attended by people who are close to the victim, who want to offer support through prayer, people who the victim trusts. The main focus of the new ritual of exorcism is a renewal of baptism. The person is baptized back into the arms of the Holy Christ, rather than into the arms of the devil. So exorcism is a process by which the victim can now renew his faith in God and the Church.
Since the introduction of psychoanalysis, we know that the devil is not necessarily to blame for mental problems. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, claiming to be possessed doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. More often than not, the person needs a psychiatrist rather than an exorcist. Some symptoms of demonic possession can bear a striking resemblance to pathologies that are now well known by medical science.
As you know, there are 3 symptoms. First of all, the person speaks in a strange language that they have no knowledge of. Secondly, the person knows hidden events. A possessed person, as we will call them for the sake of this discussion, may be able to tell you what happened to you 10 years ago, when they should have no knowledge of this. The third symptom is having increased physical or intellectual strength, depending on the person's age.
Hysteria also produces many of the symptoms typical of possession. The person is overtaken with convulsions. Its hands are clenched, its arms are bent and twisted. The expression on its face can shift from horror to anger and even rage. One of the most striking characteristics is an arched back, which practitioners refer to as the hysterical arch. It is frequently seen in cases of possession, as are most of the symptoms of hysteria. Another mental illness that is sometimes confused with demonic possession is multiple personality disorder, which is characterized by a fragmentation of the person's primary personality.
When there is a fragmentation of the personality, we speak of multiple personalities. It is the result of a traumatic experience that a child is incapable of assimilating. For example, a child placed in a situation of physical or sexual abuse is submitted to hardship and cruelty that go beyond the child's capacity to assimilate.
Sa capacité d'assimilation. Il n'arrive pas à comprendre.
It's as if the part of the child that witnessed an event that produced enormous suffering is capable of disassociating itself from the event,
Qui procure une souffrance.
as if the child split him or herself in two.
Capacité de se dissocier de l'événement. C'est un petit peu comme s'il se dédoublait. Il y a un premier dédoublement. C'est un petit peu comme pour les plantes.
There is an initial splitting like a plant. Then the fragments can branch off into others, ad infinitum.
Des cas très connus, par exemple, Billy Milligan.
Billy Milligan, for instance, who is a well-known case, had 24 personalities.
Des cas dans lesquels moi j'ai entendu
But there have even been cases with over 100.
120, 128.
The overlapping of these various symptoms puts demonic possession in a gray zone, somewhere between illness and the supernatural, a no man's land where the utmost care must be taken.
La psychiatrie peut poser un diagnostic.
In psychiatry, a case may be diagnosed as demonic possession, but the origin, the source of the possession, will not be explored by science, medicine, or psychiatry.
Les problèmes de
The problem with demonic possession, like anything else in the realm of the paranormal,
phénomènes qui sont
is that the events cannot be reproduced at will.
fondamentalement, un phénomène est dit scientifique lorsqu'il est reproductible. Les phénomènes
An event is considered to be scientific in nature when it can be reproduced.
paranormaux scientifique
Cases of possession and paranormal occurrences are very random in nature, so scientific methodology is not well suited for studying these phenomena.
possession. Oui, effectivement, ça existe.
Possession remains a highly controversial subject. Anthropologists see it as a cultural phenomenon, while those interested in spiritualism and the occult see it as a manifestation of the spirit world. And when the possession appears to be demonic in nature, the Catholic Church views it as an incarnation of the devil. A debatable conclusion that physicians prefer to avoid by attributing the symptoms to mental illness.
Il est sûr qu'aujourd'hui, en diagnostic,
Naturally, there are a lot less cases identified these days than in past centuries.
comme
As a doctor, I think that's a good thing.
c'est une bonne chose.
But there are probably still individuals who suffer from obsessions or phobias who go unnoticed by the medical system.
D'obsession ou de démonophobie, mais qui
The more humans there are on this planet, the more we feel alone.
comment dirais-je, qui échappe au système médical.
So there are probably a lot of people suffering that we just don't know about.
Donc il y a beaucoup de gens qui probablement ont ces problèmes, mais qui on le saura jamais.
The possessed person is often forgotten in the battle over whether or not the invisible entities really exist. Perhaps the most reasonable approach would be one that reflects the personal beliefs of the patient rather than those of the therapist. If a patient believes that he is possessed by his grandfather's spirit, then the assistance of a medium might prove to be more effective than 500 milligrams of an antidepressant. Whether or not the grandfather's spirit really exists is secondary in importance.
Nous avons une propension ici en Amérique du Nord à
We
vouloir
have a tendency here in North America to want to find a rational explanation for everything.
ces phénomènes que l'on ne peut pas.
We also have a tendency to deny phenomena that we cannot explain.
L'existence de phénomènes que l'on ne peut pas expliquer, mais
Other cultures accept that there are things that cannot be explained,
sur lesquels on peut agir.
and they are able to react to the phenomena without having to find a reason for why it is happening.
On cause mieux avec l'insaisissable. Mais je dirais
But
ici,
here in North America, and in Western cultures of
je
Europe,
parle du monde occidental,
it's as if we can only accept what we can explain and reproduce.
existe.
The rest just doesn't exist.
Que l'on peut
But humans are exposed to a lot of forces and stimuli that we just don't understand.
Et malheureusement, l'être humain est soumis à beaucoup de je dirais, de stimulus et de forces que l'on ne comprend pas.
It's true that science has a tendency to see human beings as a sort of biological mechanism, and from that stance, they are clearly not open to any discussion that might lead in the direction of parapsychology. But we continue to be faced with phenomena that seem to be saying that human beings are more than a simple machine made of flesh and bone.
When it comes to possession, it is clear that until science is able to document the spirit world, beliefs in disincarnate spirits will remain a question of faith. The eternal debate of knowledge versus belief.
La croyance.